Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Red Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Coltin Schachtner-Kramer. Red Effect Podcast is brought to you by REDSTAR. REDSTAR, where our red makes you green. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Red Effect Podcast. Here we have two familiar guests. We have Tom and John back again. And today we're here to talk about a couple different chemistries for both corn and soybeans. I know it's about time to start booking our chemistry for next year. So we're going to start off with going into our corn herbicides. So Tom, can you lay it out for us what we need to be considering when we do go to book our chemistry for next year?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand the situation that you're in. And I think this isn't just for the whole farm, but I think it's actually by field within the farm. It's, what weeds do I have and where's that pressure? Two, I want to make sure to understand what soil type I have, because if I've got, sand with low CEC, versus clay that's got a high CEC, that's going to, help me determine what herbicide program is going to be the best. And probably the biggest one's pH. A lot of the times when you have pH either too high or too low, there's certain chemistries that can get kind of hot in those situations, John. And so it's important to understand that soil test, take a look at the map, my pHs, my CECs, and my soil type. And, weed pressure, it's going to be, fairly subjective based on, when you're combining it, where the weed's at.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And John, one thing Tom brought up there, what type of wheat we have. So the three biggest categories would be small seeded, large seeded, broadleaves, and then grasses. So can you name just two or three species from the small seeded, large seeded, and we can guess enough grasses?
Well, the large seeded would be sunflowers or cockles.
Okay.
That would be probably the main ones in the area.
Would button weeds fall into that, or velvet leaves?
Velvet leaf would fall into a large seeded. The small seeded broadleaves, there's small seeded broadleaves and grasses fit into that same category. Small seeded broadleaves would be your water hemp, Palmer amaranth, pigweed, and then all your grasses most of your grasses fit into the small seed.
Okay. So would it be safe to say that amongst those categories, the small seeded, like our water hemp or Palmer amaranth, are the ones we're having the most resistance to?
That would be correct. And it's mainly because we treat most large seeded broadleaves with a post herbicide. 2,4-Ds and dicambas will take care of most of your large seeded broadleaves. But Palmer amaranth is probably our most resistant variety we have out there, and it's a small seeded, and we would treat them the same as we would with as far as a pre-emerge, as we would with a grass, a boxtail, or something of that nature.
Okay. So when we move in season, how do we start to kill some of these resistant weeds? Because I know everywhere you look, it keeps coming up that we have problems with water hemp. We have problems with Palmer.
Yeah, I think, the industry's done a really great job the last 7-8 years of talking about, your residual herbicides and how important it is to get those down. Unfortunately, Roundup, which was a fantastic, herbicide in its day in the Roundup Ready crops, it helped people clean up a lot of fields. However, today it's resistant. But that got us away in the farming industry, away from putting residual herbicides down, thinking we can handle everything post, and then you had products that came along like Callisto, which was just phenomenal. And, it would control pretty much all the broadleaf weeds. And so that paired with Roundup, guys had clean fields for a long time. Well, today we have resistance. I mean, that's just what it is. And so now, I believe you've got to go back to those fields and we have to start putting down not half rates, not 3/4 rates, but I'm a full rate guy. I always have been on my own farm. I still use full rates to this day. And that good foundation is going to set you up for success for the rest of the year.
The good pre-emerge, the good foundation to the beginning, that's where we have to come in and talk about the pHs and the organic matters, because if you're familiar with Sencor on soybeans, we know that in sand, it's just not a viable option, but there are other options. But that's why it's so important to know your soil types and your location. There are also restrictions on some herbicides north or south of the Interstate 80, uh, east and west of Highway 281. And then we got to start talking about potential carryover for the next year.
Definitely. So when we're looking at the long list of different herbicides we can use on corn, what are some go-tos that you guys prefer, both from the branded side and or just the generic side, whatever's best for the farmer in that situation? Because obviously some farmers both are best at different times.
Yeah, the Group 15s have been around for a long time. I'm an old Ciba-Geigy brat, so I was brought up on dual back in the day, even before they had a safener, I might add. Um, Dual's been around since the 60s. Acetochlor, which would be, your harnesses, your degrees, your keystones, those types of products. Those were discovered in the 60s. They weren't brought out till later when they got the safeners with them. But those Group 15s are really good. And the trioxysulfone, which is probably the newest Group 15, that's been out. I don't even know how many years that's been out. It's been out a while. But that one has got really good residual and very good activity on the smaller seeded weeds, John, that you were talking about earlier. So I look at that particular group and I say, yeah, they're good because they're both grass, they're strong on grasses and small seeded broadleaf weeds. Now, they're probably not going to be perfect when you start talking about Palmer amaranth and those types of things. But, they're fairly safe across most pH ranges and across most soil types. Now you got to wash the sand a little bit with those, but they're just, to me, they're really good foundation products that are, in my opinion, would be a great key to start with.
Now, do you like to put your Group 27, I believe those are the HPPDs, in with your pre's? Do you want them post or do you want them at all?
It's a great question, and as we continue to get more resistance on the HPPDs, historically, I would say most of them have been used post applied. Um, Today, I'm probably going to start moving those forward as more of a foundational treatment and then come in post emerge with some other products and active ingredients that we know can still be successful against, pigweeds and palmers.
From what I've seen just, over the past several years is that the HPPDs early is at a higher rate is really helping with Almer amaranth, small seeded broadleaves because the group 15s, they work fairly well on grasses, but it's the broadleaves that we're struggling with. And early applications seems to be working the best.
Okay. And then one thing I think you could possibly do is atrazine. Atrazine always seems like it's the wild card. So, where do you, if you like atrazine in your program, where do you like to see it? Do you like it to maybe strengthen it up early, or do you like it moved back into the season?
Well, I'm going to let John handle that one.
You got to know your weed pressure. There's, kochia. If you got a kochia problem, it really isn't going to do you much good. Otherwise, I try to split my atrazine. If we're going to do 2 applications, uh, that's seems as of synergistic effect if you got some HP. So it needs to have a little atrazine with it. So I try to split 'em.
Yeah, I think that's good. I typically, on my own farm, will try to split the atrazine, some up front with the pre-emerge or pre-plant, and then some post-emerge.
Perfect. In recent years, in recent probably last 10 years, the Liberty Link corn has really come on and it's really given us another option, another tool in our tool belt to be able to use against in-season weeds. So, what programs do you guys like to run with Liberty? And is there any accompanying herbicides that you think pair really well with that?
Great question. Again, if you're looking corn or soybeans, with the Liberty Link traits now in both crops, I'm still gonna say I want that full rate of my foundation herbicide up front, and I'm gonna use, your glufosinate or your Liberty type herbicides. I'm gonna focus on that as a rescue treatment, to where if I'm struggling to control something, I've got that option. Now, in corn, I would really like to have, every farmer, every dealer, make sure you read the glufosinate label. Also, make sure you understand the seed that you're planting. There is a restriction in corn. You can only go up to a certain height. And of course, I'm pretty conservative. Whatever that says, I usually try to back it up a little earlier than that to make sure that we get that field covered. The last thing I want to do is increase the risk of any crop injury.
And that's a real thing. I've seen that where the too late application of a glufosinate really hurt on the corn. I think all of these herbicides timing is probably just as important as the chemical that you choose. We need to get out there early. We need to try to spray weeds that are small. When they talk about 4-inch weeds, we need to be thinking about 4-inch weeds, not 14-inch weeds. That's a huge thing.
Yeah, and I think something you said earlier, John, the pressure. If I've got, if I had some escapes with Palmer amaranth, for example, 2 or 3 years ago, my seed bank is now elevated at a much higher level. I may have to use a full rate of a pre up front, and then when I come in with that rescue treatment with glufosinate or Liberty, I might have to put another residual product on just to help, extend that residual out because um, I can count how many times in my life I walk into my cornfields and I'll be out there in September and I'll see pigweeds, water hemp that tall, and they put a little bit of seed head on it. They're prolific. And so, because they're so prolific, I think we've got to make sure that we've got the best defense against them.
So with your fields, let's just say it was like this year where it was some of the guys weren't able to get out there and get their pre's on, and it is a disaster. What is your worst case scenario disaster rescue? I don't want to do this every year program.
You got to be so careful with that. That has to be a very much a case by case situation.
Yeah.
Um, when the manufacturers put on a label maximum heights, they do that for a reason. Uh, we don't want pinched ears. We don't want pods aborted on the beans. We have to be very careful with that. We have to weigh the consequences versus the gain. It's sometimes the consequences could be huge.
Yeah, and we've kind of had a tale of 2 different years here in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa. 24 we were extremely wet. 23 on the other hand, we were dry, and we'd put those foundation herbicides out. You didn't get any water on them. Weeds come through them. We had to go in and take them out. But when we did get some rain, then it finally allowed those herbicides, as most people say, to activate or to make them work, put them into solution. And so that's why I just really believe in those situations. Don't half rate it, don't three-quarter rate it, just full rate it, especially where you've had escapes from pigweeds, water hemp, Palmer amaranth.
And goes the same for glufosinate. If you're using those, dicambas, 2,4-Ds, any of the HPPDs, yeah, don't be shorting it because it's probably not going to work.
So with that, we can talk about the herbicides a lot. And one thing I think is just as important to the herbicides is one, the condition of the water, and two, the adjuvants we put with it. So can you guys talk about some different types of herbicides that we use and what the qualifications are for the quality of the water and what adjuvants that are required by label to be in there?
Yeah, I mean, with glufosinate and Liberty now kind of, becoming more predominant, sort of blowing up, so to speak. It's really the opposite of what we've done, John, for the last 22, 3, 4 years with glyphosate. Now we want, instead of less gallons an acre, we want 20 gallons an acre. And I no longer want AI tips and big droplets. I want to go back to flat fans to where I can get the coverage with that herbicide because it's more of a contact and it doesn't translocate. Um, in terms of water pH, it is so huge to make sure you've got the right pH of your water. You know, if you just look at a water hardness map in the upper Midwest, I don't care if you're in Nebraska, South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, you've got hard water, you've got calcium, you've got magnesium, you've got iron, you've got a lot of those things. And a lot of our herbicides are weak acid herbicides. They have a negative charge. And as we know, positives, opposites attract, right? And that's why my wife and I are married because I'm so positive.
We also have a tremendous amount of bicarbonates in our water. Yes, I've taken several samples over the last couple years, and they're running 300 to 400 parts per million of bicarbonates. And really what we would like to see is them 50 or below. That is a huge negative towards the efficacy of the herbicide, or we can get into foliar nutrients. It really helps to have the right bicarbonate number.
Yeah, and when you look at that too, the higher your bicarbonates and the higher your water, the higher your alkalinity, which is basically the buffer pH for your water. So that leads me to, from what you guys were saying, the best investment we can make is going to Menards and getting the pool testers to test our water so we understand how much AMS or how much pro drop we need in there in order to get the right water quality.
Absolutely. And, most of the herbicides today that we're using in corn, especially, are the weak acid herbicides. And so they're going to like a pH, 5, 5.5, sometimes even lower. And so, yeah, that's so important. And I think we just take for granted, whether it's well water or whether it's rural water, we just kind of take for granted and don't think about those things. But um, definitely, if you want to improve your herbicide performance, and a big one, John, you talk about insecticides. Uh, Having a low pH for insecticides is almost required, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's been known for years that the lower the pH, the better the insecticide works. And I think we've overlooked the herbicide portion of that because we've always relied on the pre-emerges, and that doesn't matter to them. But when we got into the Roundup, we addressed that with ammonium sulfate, but we haven't addressed it with some of the other ones. Yeah, well, I agree.
So when we're looking at other products, obviously Liberty very important for the water quality. But what are some other products that you have to accompany them with a adjuvant in order for them to work?
Yeah, I know. Again, that's going to go back to the products that you're using. An example, glyphosate or Roundup. It it itself will actually lower the pH of the water, so it likes to make sure that all that calcium and iron is sequestered, so it can't tie it up. So it likes a low pH. But that type of chemistry likes more of a spreader, more of a 90-10 type surfactant, where it can spread it out in the leaf because it translocates, and then it can allow it to penetrate that leaf system. Whereas you've got other herbicides where they want MSO, right? They need to, they struggle getting through that waxy cuticle. They need a little help from that oil to burn it through so it can get into that plant and start to work. Glufosinate, the most important thing with the glufosinate, it's already 90% surfactant in it. Ammonium sulfate, ammonium sulfate is by far the one thing that you have to have in the tank with Liberty or glufosinate to make it work. And it helps if it's sunny and 85.
With all these herbicides, read the label. It's in there for a reason, and they have that figured out. We just need to follow the label directions, and we can really make things work a lot better.
Perfect. And then staying on this post herbicide in corn, what's your guys' opinion on dicamba, say like a status, where it's a safe and one, it has more than one mode of action. Obviously, it's case by case, but what's your guys' opinion on that?
They both have their place. The straight dicambas and the statuses, which have a safener and the other active ingredient. I think they both have their place. I have found that it depends on if you have a truly dicamba resistant palmer. Yeah, if you use some status, you will have a better activity on it. It will slow it down, and that's because of the added ingredients. But in the same token, there are times when the higher rates of dicamba, as opposed to the status is a lower rate, will work better. You need to know where your weeds are at. You need to know what you have for resistance.
And I think, Colton, over the years, because of the Roundup technology, because of products like Callisto that came out to where, you could go up to 30 or 36-inch tall corn. I can't quite remember the exact height on that label. But what it did, let people get the crop bigger and they could go in and kill weeds. Now, 31 years ago, when I started in this industry, it was just the opposite. It was, pop can height. You wanted to be there or earlier to go out and knock those weeds down. And go back to something, John, you said about the label. Look at the label. There's a reason why they put on that label. It's only going to control, 2 to 4 inch weeds or 2 to 6 inch weeds for a reason. And so I think, as farmers, as retailers, we have to be cognizant of that and say, okay, will we do a better job by moving that application from V5 to V2 to V3 based on the wheat spectrum we've got and based on the product that I'm using?
With our resistance, we now have some of that has been created because we've let the weeds get too big.
Correct.
So if we can just move that application up, like you say, kill the smaller weeds and then put a pre-emerge with it, we can really gain ground at on the weeds.
Yeah, I think when I was first in the business, I think we called it row and go, and Marksman was one of the bigger products at that time, and that corn come up out of the ground, man, we were running, and there was a lot of clean fields back in those days.
The waiting for the weeds to get bigger worked great on Roundup with Roundup when it first come out because it would kill everything. It'd kill everything, but we just don't have that option anymore. We have to read those labels, stay within the weed heights, and I believe we can keep things under control.
Yeah, especially when we look at like a water hemp. That's a non-metabolic tax to keep that glyphosate resistant. So you'll never be able to kill it with glyphosate again. So following your labeled rates, making sure it's at the right height before we get another issue like what we're having with that is huge.
Another thing that comes into play when we talk about stages is crop safety. You're always going to have, for most of the time, you're going to have better crop safety when the corn plant or the bean plant is a little bit smaller. And that's something that's very important. You never want to pay money to make things worse.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I think Walt Disney says you have to hear something 3 times to remember it. Read the label of the herbicide, insecticide, or fungicide that you're using. 2, whatever adjuvant that you're using, they also have a label with it. Read that label, and make sure that you're following those labels from the adjuvants you use to the timing that they're labeled for, to how many gallons of water per acre, and the height of the weed. Read that label. They're written for a reason, and they're meant to give you the highest level of success by following them.
Definitely. So when we move on from post herbicide, I know this year it's a little too early to be predictive what we're going to have for fungal issues, unless you've been doing our RX 360 where we can go and look at what we're going to have out there. But what are some of your guys' go to fungicides? I know there's a lot of different options from a lot of different companies, but what it comes down to basically is whether we're going to have a 2 or a 3 mode action fungicide. So, what are you guys' opinions on that? Because obviously there's a place for both.
I think timing and the method of application is extremely important, and the disease that you're after. We have to know those. This past year, we had a tremendous amount of rust. That is different than when we just have gray leaf spot or northern leaf blight. We have to know what we're after. To just say that this one's better than this one, it's hard. It's a little difficult. And how we have to know when are we spraying the first one? Because how long does it have to last? What diseases do we think we're going to get? Are they going to come back like this other rust? It can move in late, tar spot. It can move in late. Does it do much damage? Here in Nebraska, we're not sure yet, but it is here. So we have to know what we're after.
Yeah, we did a lot of plot work this year, Colton, on a lot of different fungicides. I think we used all the big brand products. We also used some generic products. And rates is so huge, timing and rates. I knew it was going to be a hard year when John called me in July and said, "Yep, found southern rust. And I'm just like, okay, this is July. That's a tough one. Historically, rust in corn, whether it's seed corn, field corn, rust is, really what caused the strobilurins to shine. Um, you know, I used to sell tilt into the seed corn market, and it was phenomenal on all the diseases except for rust. And when the strobilurins came along, man, they were fantastic on rust, right? Well, even over the years, using the strobilurins, they're not as good. Now we've got the three ways. We've got the curatives, and you got the strobilurins, the preventatives, and now we have these SDHIs. And, there's differences in the SDHIs, obviously, but, picking the one that's going to be best for the disease that you have. And I think you said it earlier, this year we had rust. It was the main issue. Well, there's two or three of those that are a little stronger on rust than their competitive one. And so those probably tend to shine a little bit more this year versus if we get into would you say the normal, the gray leaf spot, the northern corn leaf blight, those are generally year in and year out. And then tar spot, we had tar spot move in this year. I think it came in a little later, which is, I think, a blessing. Um, but yeah, I think, just understand the fungicide that you're using, know what's in it, uh, you know, know what kind of control you can expect from it. And, you might have to spray it twice. That's just the reality of where we're at today. One application may not do it.
Another thing that you need to think about is like what you said, rates. It's no different than what you talked about rates with herbicides. The industry as a whole has kind of used mid-range rates on fungicides for years. I think we're kind of past that. We need to possibly step that up.
Yeah, especially with the diseases we know are coming in. And tar spot, it's here. It's not if it bites us, it's when it bites us. And like you said, Tom, traditionally it comes in later. But we were at a meeting last week where they said it can be 50, 60, maybe even 70 bushel of a hit. And it's something we got to be prepared for. And we got to be ready to come to the line and call the audible and be able to go with that. And Tom, so you talk about two applications. Are you talking about a three-way both time? Are you talking about a three-way the first time, a two-way the second, or vice versa?
It's a really great question. And, for planning purposes, I think you can say, okay, we're in November, going to be here in December pretty quick, starting with prepay and starting to decide. What I decided to do last year, because I've got some ground in central Iowa where tar spot's been a problem for 3 or 4 years. You know, I prepaid for two applications, and I did a 3/8 and a 3-way on one, and I did, a 2-way on the back end of that. And the plan was to go in there with, the 3-way first, and then come back with the 2-way. And again, there's so many factors, Colton, that go into that. Where am I at? Am I in northern Iowa? Am I in central Iowa? Am I south of Interstate 80? There's just so many things that factor into those decisions. Am I irrigated or not irrigated? I mean, John, there's just so many factors that determine what you do, but just have a plan,
Mm.
and then you can always adjust that plan later.
Planning date?
Because certain diseases are going to affect things later on. As the days get shorter, the diseases kind of slow down. That's huge. Population, row widths, all play into how the fungicides work.
Perfect. So switching gears here to soybeans, we're going to start over again at the top. So when we look at pre-emerge soybeans, obviously we have to use some slightly different chemistry compared to corn. So what are some of the most common in the industry for soybean pre-emerge?
Great question. I think, again, I go back to those group 15s, the proaxosulfones, the metolachlors, those types, I think are good foundations. A lot of companies out there have, some other broadleaf type products that they put with them to make sure that they're getting a very good grass and broadleaf type foundation weed control. I think those are critical in soybeans, especially with the water pressure that we have.
Also, another thing with those is, what is your long-term plan? Do you plan on doing 2 post-emerges, or do you just plan on doing 1? Are we non-GMO? That seems to be a little bit of a hot topic, non-GMO beans. So we have to be very aggressive early. Later on, we could be a little more lax, because just a lot of things just play into it. But the pre-emerge group 15s are your main player.
Perfect. And then as we move into post application, obviously last year, now this year, over the top dicamba in season is out of the picture. So where do we move on, especially these higher weed population fields, in order to continue to have good control?
It's really a great question. And, Enlist One now is going to be on a lot more acres. And the Enlist One label does not really allow for any rate ranges. The rate is 32 ounces. It's 32 ounces. You can't go 48 ounces. You can't go 64. The rate's 32. And so I think looking at that and looking at how that product has worked the last 3 years, we have a history now with it. We understand what it will do, and we also understand its limitations. And so from there, to me, that first pre-plant or that pre-emerge, pass that we put down, we gotta have a lot of bang in it. We gotta have something that's gonna be there for us, and that's gonna give us a good 7, 8 weeks of residual, and, that's still not gonna be enough.
One thing about the Enlist beans is we can also go back in with glufosinate or Liberty, and with the Enlist, and you put another group 15 in there, another pre-emerge, you can lengthen that control out a long time, and that's what we need.
Yeah, because with soybeans, it's a race to see how clean we can keep it till canopy. And obviously, if you're in 15-inch rows, you're probably going to canopy way sooner than you are with a 30, but it's still an issue. So, Tom, have you seen many guys doing a two pass in season system when they still have a pre emerge? Or are they eliminating that pre emerge, which probably wouldn't be recommended, and then going with the two pass in season?
Um, yeah, most people today are really putting down a very strong full rate residual product, group 15, group 27 together, to just get a good strong foundation. And then they're also coming back too, whether they're using glufosinate or Liberty, or if they're using Enlist One and Enlist soybeans, they're also coming back and putting down, another group 15 with it. Might be peroxysulfone. It might be, product like Warrant, which is acetylchlor labeled for soybeans, and it might be metolachlor. Um, Again, beans, because they don't canopy as fast or as completely, as I guess is the best word to say, as corn, you're always going to have more light interception. And the water temp doesn't have to get as tall to get above the soybean plant. And I know I personally saw this on my field this year. Didn't get planted till June 10th. Couldn't get the pre-emerge on because it was so wet. Had to come in post-emerge, with post and pre all in one. Fortunately, I got enough rain where that residual worked, and I went with a full rate, even though the beans were, 8, 10 inches tall. I was very fortunate that that lasted all season, got enough rain to make it work. But if I hadn't have had that, I'd probably been out there at least 3 times spraying glufosinate, trying to clean them up.
That second spray, post-emerge spraying is just kind of gotta be up in the air unless you plan on it. Like you say, row widths, the time of the year that you plant them, they canopy quicker than others. And there's bushy hybrids. There's tall hybrids and there's bushy hybrids. Those things all have to play into that decision.
And I think it goes back to Colton, to what we talked about earlier. What weeds do I have and where are they at? What's my soil type and what's my pH? And that maybe plays more so on soybeans than it does on corn, because there's some chemistries that are a little more sensitive to soybeans than what corn is to them. And so that plays a big part in the decision you're going to make for weed control in 25.
Yeah, and the way I kinda saw it this year is there are some fields you could tell, like, the soybeans just got stunted, and even though they might have already had 2 passes out there, you could start to see them coming, It's just the question of whether we're within label or not for that crop is what we're really running into. So I think it's all got to be a decision at the time, and always talk to your local agronomist because they're going to know that area the best.
And this year, with what you said, the stunted beans, that's very true. You just can't get as much rain as we had this year
Yeah.
and expect things to metabolize. We had cold, it was rainy, things didn't metabolize, so there was a little more crop damage. So that's more soybeans than corn.
Yeah. And with, looking at soybeans as well, with glufosinate or Liberty, there also is a label restriction there too. You can only go to a certain level. And like you said a little bit earlier, you don't want to knock the pods off. Um, there were some people that had that happen this year because the water hemp was so bad. They're like, I don't have an option, and they did it, and it hurt them. So again, I just think that just continues to be, an avenue or a campaign of full rates, full rates, full rates. From the time we plant to the time we spray it that first or second time post emerge.
And if you think it's time, you should have probably done it a few days ago.
Yes.
So just almost always the earlier the better. It's quicker than you think.
Just remember to go from that 4-inch wheat to an 8-inch wheat is probably about 3 days, especially when it doesn't take long. Yeah, especially late June when we got moisture and it's warm. It's growing fast. So if you see a 4-inch wheat, you're probably already too late.
Yeah. And sometimes we're out there spraying 28 days, 35 days after planting. And we're like, why are we out here spraying? Because there's nothing coming up. But you're always glad that you did because you're like, I'm gonna let it go. 4 days later, it's a dream carpet.
Or you catch a rain event. Yeah, definitely. So moving on to fungicide on soybeans. One thing that we're going to have to watch out for this year, I think, is going to be big both back in Iowa and Nebraska is in 2023, there was a lot of white mold around. And this year, we probably didn't see it as much because the inoculum was in a cornfield. Well, now we're going back to a soybean field. And so if we talk about specifically white mold here, Tom, I know there's a product that we have to help control it. Can you give just a brief overview of what we could do with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've kind of been on a Contan's high horse for the last 2 years, but you're exactly right. The fall of 23, we had a lot of white mold that hurt a lot of guys' yields, and it hurt them pretty bad. And now we're going back into those fields. Um, White mold is a soil-borne problem. Okay, it starts in the soil. And we've got a lot of producers that want to try to solve that problem with a foliar fungicide. The foliar fungicides can offer a bit of protection against the blooms. However, they're not a complete solution whatsoever. So Contans is a biological fungicide. It can be used at 1 to 2 pounds an acre. Coming this spring, we'd really like to see about 1.5 pounds. You can mix it with your pre-emerge herbicide program. Just make sure to stay away from any nitrogen sources or a 1034O if you're using that as a carrier. For fertilizer, just use water. And you can get it out there, you can spray it. And once it hits the soil, it goes to work to basically eat the food source that the sclerotia that the white mold, basically clings to be able to, start that whole process of, making the little trombone and puffing the spores there in June and July. And it works well. It's been very documented that it works well. It can be a little bit spendy. It can be anywhere from 21 to 26 bucks an acre. However, if you make it part of your program, you'll be happy that you did it because you'll start to get ahead of the white mold over the next 3 to 4 years.
One thing about white mold is you have to be proactive. Whether it be contents or whether you do try a foliar, you can't wait till you see it. If you waited till you see it, you've waited too long. And then it's tough to control. It's a lot easier to contain.
Contain with Contans. I like that. That might be our marketing campaign for spring for white mold.
There you go. So what are some other foliar diseases that we see come in on soybeans that we really need to start watching for?
Early on, usually the end of June, first part of July, that's when you start to see some tan spot and brown spot starting to develop on those lower leaves of those beans as they start their elongation. And so that's a good time, if you want to go out there with a fungicide early with your first, in crop herbicide program. It's good because those are going to become the older leaves of those soybean plants. And if you go out there and you put a fungicide on at that time, it's just going to help protect them and make sure that they, can continue to photosynthesize as that plant grows and gets bigger.
And you'll be able to see it where the fields that you do spray something, R1 or thereabouts, that the bottom leaves will stay green where if untreated, a lot of times they'll start to turn yellow up about a foot. And you just lose that energy that those leaves can bring in.
Yeah.
Well, and by losing that plant health down low, we're going to start to lose those pods.
Correct.
And there are a lot of pods stacked in that bottom couple layers of that plant. So it is essential for us to make sure we maintain that to maintain the yield of those soybeans. And Tom, John, we talk a lot about soybeans. We know there's a lot of potential. I feel as if we just need to stop treating soybeans as a cover crop like most people do and really pay attention to them. And we'd be amazed what those things can do.
The soybeans they're a valuable crop. I mean, they not only give us a rotation option, but they can be good income. One of the things with all the fungicides and the post-emerge applications, foliar fertilizers, some nutrients really can help soybeans out at the right time.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think we're learning a lot about the impact of micronutrients in soybeans and the fact that, we're probably not spraying enough manganese, enough zinc, enough boron, enough copper, even some farms and fields with some iron deficiencies, that can make a big difference. But, the things we're finding out, those micronutrients are huge in terms of that plant being able to pull its phosphorus, its potassium, and even nitrogen from the soil. And so because we tend to, treat soybeans, not as good as we do corn, we're not fertilizing them right. And I think, people like Alex Harrell, the world record holder for soybeans at 218 bushels, I think he's starting to bring a lot of light to what actually can happen in soybeans. And I just think a lot of us, from a management standpoint, we're probably looking at the wrong things.
Kind of goes back to balancing, we balance the soil. We also have to balance the plant. Nutrients all flow together.
Yes.
And if you're short one, the lowest hole in the bucket is the one you need to fill. And if it's something that we aren't aware of, a good general foliar can a lot of times helps out.
Yeah, and that's the nice part about our REDSTAR branded products is when we are out there doing our herbicide or fungicide applications, if we got a wide variety of ones that can fit in there, and we can cover about any option or any problem that you have.
One thing that, looking through some of our plot yield data, Colton, one thing that we did notice is where we had calcium in furrow, we had some nice yield bumps. And, it's not that much calcium, and it was just early in furrow. But, when you start to see 3 to 5 bushel yield bumps and you kind of go, oh, that nutrient is responsible. Again, if you're coming out of a big corn crop, which uses a lot of calcium, and you're going into that soybean crop, you may not have as much free available calcium for that soybean crop. So,
and you couple that with looking at some fields that have been limed lately and their yields versus the ones next to them, or the basically high free lime soils, that yielded very well.
So circling back to our topic here about different chemistries and stuff, obviously some fungicides work better on soybeans than others. What would be your guys' ones that just really stand out that, yes, that fungicide likes soybeans?
To me, that's more of a timing thing.
Okay.
There are fungicides that work fairly well on white mold if you get them in R1. They're not perfect, and there's some that really won't do anything. So it's really what you're after again. And timing of when it is. Are you doing an August 1st fungicide, or are you doing an R1 fungicide, which is going to be, for a part of July? It makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think it goes back, John, to something you said a little while ago. If I've got white mold, okay, even if I'm using contans down in the soil, to sort of help with eating that sclerotia, I can come in with a low cost, generic fungicide with that first in crop application of herbicide and just help protect those early blooms that are there. I think that's key. And again, knowing your timing there and knowing what you're going after. I always go back when you look at fungicides to, BSF has done a tremendous amount of work over the years in northern Iowa on soybean fungicides. And, this is some old data going back, so look it up. It may not be exact, but is if you spray at R2, it was like 2.5 bushels. And if you waited till R3, it's 5.5 bushels. And I've always said, wow, if I got to go to the state fair, but I got to get the beans sprayed, but they're only R2, I can only get 2.5 bushels. But if I would wait around and miss the fair for a few days to get 5.5, you can actually hire somebody for 3 bushels to go spray it. And so I think that timing is so critical, as John mentioned. And I think those are some things that we've maybe gotten away from the last few years in really looking at how important is that timing to the yield result at the end.
Definitely. So, sum it up today. Timing, follow the label, and make sure you got the shortest weeds possible.
You'll be a long ways to being successful if you do it.
Yeah. Timing is just huge when we're with any of them, any of the nutrients or the insecticides or fungicides or herbicides that we spray on anything. Timing is huge. And again, like you said, follow the label.
And I think nozzles, if you've been spraying Roundup for years and years and you've got AI tips and now you're going to spray Liberty glufosinate, you can do everything right, follow the label, the right gallons, everything. But if you still got that AI tip, you're going to be disappointed. So look at your spray nozzles too. The label will actually help you with that as well on what nozzles perform best with that herbicide or that pesticide.
Perfect. Well, thanks guys, and we'll see everybody else later.